To introduce our speaker today is Clinton School student Georgia Chenoweth from Maryland County, Liberia, a graduate of African Methodist Episcopal University, where she studied communication and English. She volunteered with the Liberian National Red Cross. In October, many of you may recall this, the Democrat Gazette did a wonderful article titled, "For Clinton School Student, Ebola Close to Home," in which Georgia described her experiences and her friends and her family in her home country in relation to that awful epidemic. She is working this semester on a student team project with the Clinton Climate Initiative on a Healthy Homes Initiative, which deals specifically with the impact of weatherization and whether it can make a difference on people, particularly children, with asthma. She is going back to Liberia this summer for her International Public Service Project, where she's going to work on youth services. Think of a Liberian AmeriCorps. And that's what she's going to be working on. Please welcome Clinton School student Georgia Chenoweth.
Thank you very much. When I first saw the opportunity for introducing speakers, my eyes caught the name of our speaker today. As a young advocate, I'm thrilled by her courage and passion for peace. I thirst for solutions when the peace and security of women and children are threatened. It was a bit difficult for me to come up with a brief introduction because our speaker today has a long history of public service and has done so many interesting things around the world. However, I succeeded in developing this biography. It was interesting watching her speak at TED when she provided strong recommendations to avoid violence. Her speech helped me reflect on how the 14 years of civil conflict in my country, Liberia, ended due to the help of a nonviolence movement group organized by Christian and Muslim women. Our speaker is an associate professor at the Josef Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver and an associate senior researcher at the Peace Research Institute of Oslo. In addition to her teaching career, she taught at the Wesleyan University and held engagements at Harvard, Stanford, University of Colorado, Berkeley, and the University of Maryland. Our speaker received her master's and doctorate degrees in political science from the University of Colorado. Prior to that, she received a BA in political science and German from the University of Dayton. In 2010, she received the Carol A. Baker Memorial Prize, which recognizes excellence in junior faculty teaching. In 2012, Woodrow Wilson Foundation awarded her for the best book on government, politics, or international affairs published in the US in 2011. Recently, in 2013, Foreign Policy magazine ranked her among the top 100 leading global thinkers of the year. Also in 2013, her book with Maria J. Esteban, Why Civil Resistance Works, won the Grand Melchior Award for Ideas Improving the World Order. Her books, blogs, and the several articles she has written have been featured and published by the New York Times, the Washington Post, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, The Economist, the Boston Globe, and the Christian Science Monitor. She has spoken and made many appearances at many galleries in the world. To name a few, she spoke at TED Talk and also appeared at the 2013 World Summit of Nobel Peace Prize laureates. Despite her hard work and busy schedule, which is very interesting, she spends her leisure time fly fishing and chilling in the Rocky Mountains. When I watched her speak at TED Talk on YouTube, I thought it was interesting and funny in ways that I may connect to the speaker. During her presentation, she explained a story about how she had desires to join the army. I had desire to join the army in my country too. I also love the forest green and khaki uniforms in Liberia. But when she said she quitted the army to becoming a professor because she vomited after running long miles, I laughed. And I thank God for not even trying to start the military training in Liberia. Nevertheless, her work as a professor and writer had changed several lives and made many people realize that violence is not the solution. Ladies and gentlemen, would you help me welcome our speaker today, Dr. Professor Erica Chenoweth.
Well, thank you very much for having me at this amazing school. I've been delighted to meet your students and also meet some people that I've met before, including one of the students here that I met in Hong Kong in 2011. So really small world that we're in here. And I'm delighted to share the next hour with you. So what I'm going to do is talk to you a little bit about the research that was just mentioned, but I'm going to first tell you where I was when I started the research. So I was, in 2006, finishing my doctoral dissertation. The topic was on why terrorism is so common in democratic countries. All of my interests and my training was in trying to uncover the reasons why people resort to political violence, even when they have other obvious alternatives to doing that. And everything that I did was basically forecasting violence, trying to figure out ways to combat violence, and so forth. And you know, having read through people's autobiographies, their notes, lots of different case histories about things like war-making, genocide, mass rape, and the ways that people rationalize violence in general, I'd become a little bit skeptical about pacifistic ideals, nonviolence, or anything related to nonviolent alternatives. And at that time, I received an email invitation from a colleague of mine that said, "The other side of the coin, ha ha." And he sent me this email kind of as a joke, honestly. And it was to an event that was being hosted at Colorado College, which is down the road from me, called People, Power, and Pedagogy. The event was sponsored by an educational foundation called the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. And their main mission is to try to get security studies scholars and people like me to take nonviolence seriously. So I accepted this invitation and applied to the workshop because I noticed that they were offering free books and free food, which was enough to get me then, and honestly, it's still enough to get me now. Basically, they sent this box of books in advance by people like Gene Sharp, Peter Ackerman, Jack Duvall, Kurt Schock, and a variety of other scholars who had long developed case histories of examples where people power or nonviolent civil resistance had succeeded. Now, one of the things that really struck me was that the way they defined nonviolent civil resistance was different from the image that I had in my mind about it. When I thought of nonviolence, I thought of a bunch of people who were, for moral reasons, committed to pacifism or to aversion to violence. And the way they were talking about it was as a strategic technique, a way to actually build power where there was none, a way to actually wage an active, powerful conflict against a potentially powerful adversary, but without using violence or the threat of violence or any type of violent weapon in the course of that activity. In fact, they use the word weapons, but when they use the word weapons, they use it to describe things like strikes, protests, boycotts, stay-aways, go-slows, and hundreds of other techniques that they'd observed people to use around the world to try to free themselves of the burden of intolerable circumstances. So I was very struck by this. It was a different way of thinking about it than I'd had before. And when I went to the workshop, I tried to have an open mind, but to tell you the truth, I was still pretty skeptical. And after a few days of kind of repeated interactions, a colleague of mine that I met there, a woman named Maria Stefan, and I had a pretty heated argument one night. And her argument was that nonviolent resistance works. I can give you all the examples, you know, Serbia, the Philippines, and many other places. And I kept saying, well, for every example you can come up with of a success, I can think of a failure. I can think of Tiananmen Square. I can think of the Prague Spring. I can think of any number of examples. And so what we decided we had to do was to count and find out who was right. Unfortunately, there was no nobler cause at that point than to try to discover whether you could actually make a generalizable empirical claim that one was more effective than the other. And I had a few key reservations, which I'm going to call common claims, because I actually do hear them repeated all the time. So the first major reservation I had is that there's no way nonviolent resistance can succeed unless the regime is very weak, unless it's unwilling to use repression against the people, and unless it's basically more or less democratic, or at very best, a very weak authoritarian regime. An authoritarian regime that didn't really want to be one anymore, if there is such a thing. So that was the first reservation, that if the state that you're opposing through your resistance is very powerful, militarily superior, is willing to use violence against unarmed people, and is very closed to political organizing because of its authoritarian nature, that you can't do nonviolent resistance there. The second major reservation I had was that nonviolent resistance might work if you're trying to get reform, if you're trying to push for things that maybe aren't that controversial in the first place, but that nobody ever really had the pressure to adopt. But if what you were trying to do would fundamentally reshape the nature of the country you're living in, the social relations in that country, or even the territory of the country, that those types of maximalist goals are ones that we typically associate with violent insurgency, that usually you can't do that with nonviolent resistance. And then the third reservation I had in my mind is that, a lot of people were kind of poo-pooing violence as being something that never worked. And in fact, there was an article that had come out that summer of 2006, by a guy named Max Abrams, one of my colleagues. And he wrote this article called Why Terrorism Does Not Work. And in it, he counts all the different terrorist groups that he'd documented around the world. And he found that only 7% of them got what they said they wanted. So at the end of the article, he then goes on to say, if it's only 7% effective, then why does it happen so often? And he speculates that perhaps at just 7% effectiveness, it's still more effective than what nonviolent alternatives might have been. So in other words, the dominant intellectual strain at the time was suggesting that nonviolence was probably very, very ineffective. So Maria and I sat down and decided to count, and we went to the Correlates of War database. So who has heard of the Correlates of War? Raise your hand if you've heard of Correlates of War. Nobody, okay. You shouldn't go look at it. It's really boring. What it is that political scientists have been counting every war in the world since about 1300. So if you want to know whether there was a war, we've been counting it for decades. It's on the Correlates of War data set, and we know who did it, who started it, who finished it, who won, what it was about, how many people died, where it was. We know all that detail. And I went to the Correlates of War database, very common database, and I extracted all the cases where there were at least 1,000 people participating in this war. And I looked only at cases that were subnational, so only where it was a group of insurgents fighting a state. And I only then looked at 3 different types of cases. Cases where the insurgents were trying to remove the incumbent power, the leader of the government. Cases where the insurgents were trying to kick out a foreign military occupation or colonial power. And cases where the insurgents were trying to secede from the territory and become an independent country themselves. So then I went searching for the correlates of nonviolent conflict data set. And none of you has ever heard of that. I know it because it doesn't exist. We had to build that one from the ground up over 2 years. And what we did is we swept through everything we could find that had ever been written about nonviolent conflict. We read documents in English and in other languages that between the two of us we could navigate. We read news reports. We read expert kind of archives and documents related to protests. We looked at databases on protests. We looked at a variety of other things. And we constructed a data set of analogous cases, those cases where they were trying to remove the dictator, where they were trying to kick out foreign military or colonial occupation and secede, except in these cases, the people were waging this struggle nonviolently. They were not using weapons in the violent conventional sense. At the end of that data collection process, she and I had assembled 323 campaigns of mass resistance. We then circulated our list to about 12 experts around the world and asked them to evaluate, first of all, whether we left anyone out, and second of all, how they would evaluate the success rates of those campaigns that we identified. So they came back and gave us their assessments, and we kind of put them all together and created this consensus-based data set. Since then, I have updated the data. It was from 1900 to 2006 and covered the entire world. Now we have data through 2014. So what I'm going to present to you now is the data through 2014, but know that most of the findings that are substantive findings are based on the data through 2006 from our book. So what did we find? We found that I was the one who was mistaken, and Maria was the one who had the right impulses. Nonviolent resistance from 1900 through 2014 has been over twice as likely to succeed as violent insurgency. It also has an edge with regard to limited success, which is when the campaigns are able to extract major concessions from their opponents. And violent resistance is substantially more likely to fail outright. If you look at the trend lines in terms of the onsets of these mass campaigns, the most striking thing is that the blue bars, their violent campaign onsets, are in decline, quite substantial decline, as a matter of fact, in the last 20, 25 years. Whereas nonviolent resistance is on the rise. I'll point out that that last column is just from 2010 to 2014. And what you'll see there is that we already have more nonviolent campaigns in the first 5 years of this particular decade than we had in most other decades and the previous years, all full decades. So 1990 was a very active decade. The 80s, obviously, with the Eastern European revolutions was big. The 2000s were really big because of the color revolutions and many other lesser-known ones, perhaps. And then we've already seen a huge burst of activity since 2010. The trends are very interesting over time. As you can see here, nonviolent resistance has been steadily increasing in its effectiveness, averaging out to, again, above 50% across this entire time series. Violent resistance has been slowly declining in its effectiveness. Now it's just over 10% of violent insurgencies end well for the insurgents. So 1 in 10 is going to succeed, as opposed to 1 in every other nonviolent campaign. What you can see with this particular drop is that the 1990s and the 2000s were particularly successful decades, and we count the ongoing campaigns that are happening in this decade as failures. So that's what might explain the decline to the 30%. But as you can see, it's still 3 times more effective in this decade than violence. So why is that happening? Well, I have to confess that it took me a little while to wrap my mind around the fact that these findings might be real. And what we did was we bombarded the study with all kinds of robustness checks, with all kinds of corrections for potential for underreporting. We looked at all kinds of different conditions in the countries in which these campaigns were arising to see if maybe they were affecting the outcomes, and none of that held up. So then I was a bit stunned, and we decided we had to write a book about it. For those of you who have read the book, I'm sorry. We thought that it would probably be read by 7 people, and so we didn't make it quite as accessible as we probably should have, but we're going to try to fix that next time. So why has civil resistance been so effective relative to its armed equivalents? Well, what we found when we drilled down into the data is that the real power of nonviolent resistance inheres in its ability to attract broad-based, diverse, and large-scale participation from the population. And that actually, the quality and quantity of participation in any type of revolutionary movement is what basically determines its success. So here's a chart that's from our book that shows you the near linear association between the number of people participating in any type of mass movement and the probability that it succeeds, controlling for a variety of other factors. What you can see from this chart is that it's a little hard to interpret this because that's a logarithmic scale. But the basic point is that any campaign that has surpassed 3.5% of the population and participation size has succeeded. Outright succeeded, not just limited success, but they win. Now, this isn't super surprising because there was an economist named Mark Lickbach who had speculated in the mid-1990s that you only needed 5% of the population to rise up in order for any type of mass uprising to succeed. 5%. He calls it the 5% rule. And he says that it's often difficult to get any more than 5%, actually, of the population, but that's all that's usually required for success. Our data shows that he was pretty close in that estimate, but it's 3.5%, so a little bit lower. That's nothing to sneeze at. In the US, 3.5% of the population's 11.5 million people or so. So you can imagine 11.5 million people do anything for 9 months in the US with regard to civil disobedience, and something's going to happen, right? I mean, that's a large number of people, and that's a lot of disruption. So it's not rocket science, really, that big groups of people can affect major change. The really interesting insight that Maria's and my data shows us, though, is that no movements surpass that 3.5% threshold without being nonviolent ones. So a lot of movements succeeded with less people than that, but the ones that surpassed that all succeeded, and they were all nonviolent. So why would people be more likely to participate in a nonviolent movement, especially in a brutal, oppressive system? We think there are 4 major reasons. The first is just a physical reason in itself, that sometimes sitting on your couch for 3 days in your house is a very effective form of nonviolent protest. And that means anybody can do it. Anybody at any physical level of ability can sit on their couch for 3 days, although you might want to move around a little bit. You might want to move around. But you don't have to leave your house, maybe, in 3 days. And that can be, when done by 3 million people in a major urban center, a massively disruptive technique of nonviolent action. So first of all, there's just such a wide variety of techniques available to actively engage in a struggle like this that it can capture women, children, people who have a disability, minorities who ordinarily wouldn't participate because of the high risks associated with this type of action, and the elderly. Once a movement is able to actively engage those sectors of society, already its mobilization potential has over doubled, relative to if it's just a group of able-bodied young men. The second lower barrier to participation is a lower commitment barrier. And by this, I don't mean commitment to the cause, but I mean in terms of the decisions you have to make to get in and the decisions you have to make to get out. So anybody that's joining an armed group is going to be making a very serious and permanent life choice. They're going to often have to leave behind everything they think they know about what ordinary life looks like. They leave behind their family, their schooling, their friends, their job, their day-to-day routine. And they're going to go and they're going to basically live underground if they live in an urban center, or they're going to live out in the jungle or in the frontier if they're not. This is uncomfortable. And it also means that if you're engaged in any type of armed activity over a sustained period of time, you probably kill somebody or hurt somebody. That means it's very hard to leave. Because as soon as they join that group becomes their protection. It's very hard for them to get out. For nonviolent resistance, that's not the case at all. The group can maintain certain levels of anonymity for the people that participate. In very high-risk places, sometimes electricity strikes, for example, are a method of participation that are very hard to identify who's doing it. That's when everybody shuts off their electricity at the same time for about 4 hours a night or something along those lines. There are also pots and pans demonstrations. It's really hard to figure out when you hear thunderous pots and pans banging which people are doing it and which homes. So there are all kinds of different low-risk techniques that can be very disruptive and powerful, but that don't require that level of commitment to entry and exit that armed activity does. The third lower barrier to participation is a lower informational barrier. And by this, I simply mean that if you're a total coward like me, and you're in your apartment and you're living in a very repressive environment, let's say your neighbor comes to you and says, we're going to have a demonstration in the main square at 8 o'clock tonight. Here's a little escape route because we know the police will be there, and I hope that you can come. Now, if you're like me, you're not the person who's there at 7:55, checking it out and starting things up. I'm going to wait until about 8:30, 8:45 and take a look out my window and see what's going on. And if I see 6,000 people assembling in that square and it looks like a party, and I maybe see my neighbor there, knows somebody I know, then maybe I'll join in. And by this visible technique, they've overcome the informational barrier of anybody that's going to self-recruit into any type of mobilization, which is, am I going to be alone? And how many people are there going to be? And will there be safety in numbers? Or when I show up at the secret warehouse and give the secret handshake, am I just going to find 6 people that have been blowing up a lot of stuff and so look way bigger than they are? So that's a very important communication problem that many armed groups have, that civil resistance techniques are deliberately meant to overcome. And then the final lower barrier to participation is a lower cognitive barrier. This simply means that among human beings that have high levels of moral or cognitive inhibitions to using offensive violence, participation in a nonviolent campaign is not an issue for them. Whereas for many armed groups, they have to go out of their way to override the circuitry of our minds and say, use offensive violence. And that's why there's so many different conditioning exercises. It's trying to remove people's hesitation to kill. Fortunately, the human race has evolved hesitation to kill. That's a good thing. And for nonviolent resistance, it means that it's easier to get people to participate. So why is participation so important? Now, contrary to what a lot of people think, it's not just because it symbolizes something. We think that actually the more people who participate in a campaign, the more possible it is that those participants are going to know people who are in the security forces. They're going to have friends that are basically functional economic elites. They're going to know civilian bureaucrats. They're going to know people in the media. They're going to know religious and cultural authorities in the society. Those are what Gene Sharp calls pillars of support. These different groups or pillars on whose cooperation, obedience, and help the power holder relies to stay in power. So what happens is that there's no such thing as any type of government leadership that is immune to challenge from below, because they totally rely on these pillars of support in order to stay in power. And when civilian population starts to tug on those pillars because they happen to have a neighbor who's also the chief of police, they can actually activate very interesting relational dynamics. One of the most concrete examples of how this plays out comes from the Serbian case, where hundreds of thousands of people were descending on Belgrade in October of 2000 to try to get Milosevic to step out of office. Now, when these hundreds of thousands of people were coming, they had gathered allies among some of the mayors of the outlying provinces, who then were able to steal some of the police officers' walkie-talkies because they had access to them. And so the activists themselves had these walkie-talkies, and when they were coming on to Belgrade, they were listening to the orders that were coming down to both special forces and police. And they could hear the order to shoot live fire into the demonstrators. So they heard it come down, and then they looked at the police, and the police were all just standing in lines, kind of shifty-eyed looking at each other. Not a single one of them followed the order. And then afterward, they were interviewed by various scholars and journalists, and they all said things like, I didn't shoot because I thought my kids might be in the crowd. I didn't shoot because I saw my neighbor. I didn't shoot because I saw the guy who sells me the vegetables in the grocery store, and I thought if he saw me do that, I could never go to that store again, right? Mundane, day-to-day, personal stories that are activated by this moment of crisis in the society, but where they recognize in their own minds their own interest in disobeying the order. So, of course, Milosevic had to leave the country that day, which he did. So this is the theory. This was Gene Sharp's theory of how nonviolent action actually plays out strategically, and we tested the theory using our data, and it turns out that he was really onto something. Here you can see violent campaigns, and as they grow in size, the probability that security forces defect stays roughly around between 20 and 25%. It doesn't get much higher than that. So the biggest violent campaigns you have only have a 1 in 4 chance of eliciting those loyalty shifts within security forces. Now this makes sense. If you're serving in some kind of combat unit and you're up against a really large insurgency, it's pretty scary to consider defecting to their side. Instead, usually what happens is you're going to tighten up with your unit and fight for dear life. Now, for nonviolent campaigns, you can see that the larger they get, the more likely it is that those security forces defect. That's that relational dynamic playing out in our data. So, what happens when they do shoot? Because they do, right? They do shoot sometimes, they sometimes shoot often throughout the campaign, and they brutalize these demonstrators severely. Even when there is brutal repression against these campaigns, which there almost always is, we find that these campaigns are still outperforming violent ones by a 2-to-1 margin. So why would that be the case? We think there are 2 reasons. The first is a generalized pattern that repression against unarmed people tends to backfire more often than repression against armed people. The reason is because backfire, a process in which you get the opposite outcome of the one you intended, is more likely to occur when there's a sense of shared moral outrage, that the repression itself was excessive, unjust, or disproportional to the threat. And it makes sense why, even globally, that people view repression against unarmed people as excessive, unjust, and disproportional to the threat. The second reason, which I think is maybe even more important, is that repression against mass movements is pretty hard to do over the long term. And often what we'll see is repression early on, and then it tapers off toward the end, like the Serbian model. And what happens is that when you have very large numbers of people participating, there are a number of dynamics and tactics that are available to these very large campaigns. Now, concentrated tactics are where people come together in a particular space. They assemble mass, very disruptive, pretty pictures in the New York Times, but also very difficult for people to sustain and very dangerous. These are the types of episodes where you get 1,000 people killed in a day because they can just be rounded up and hurt. So movements that succeed often mix these types of concentrated techniques with dispersed techniques. Now that's an example from Kashmir, and it's a general strike. Now what in this case they announced is that there would be a demonstration in the main square. So these fellows had to show up, and they're getting paid overtime, I'm sure, for this, and then nobody's there. So it costs the opponent, and it costs the movement nothing, except what it would take to get through that day of that general strike. A very interesting example of this comes from the Iranian Revolution, where in the first 90 or so days of the 100 Days Revolution, we saw a lot of techniques of concentration, demonstrations, rallies, funeral processions, and the like. And this was becoming tough. There were probably between 2,000 and 3,000 people gunned down in the streets during that time, more at a much higher rate of violence that even was occurring in the Syrian uprising in the beginning, if you can imagine. So this was happening. And then what happened is that in the last 10 days, they were able to get the oil workers to go on strike. Now, the oil workers paired the strike with a stay-at-home demonstration. That means that to get the oil fields pumping, they had to send the internal police, the special security forces, door to door to the oil workers' homes, which they did. And they pulled them back out into the streets and marched them down to the oil fields. And when they got there, they only worked at half pace. So the next day, they stay at home. Security forces come door to door, drag them out of onto the street, march them down there. They work at half pace. After about 3 or 4 days of this, security forces start calling in sick. Why? Because that's a very personal and very uncomfortable kind of repression, and they were convinced that because of the half-pace work, they would not get paid the overtime they were promised for this dirty work. Now, that was not true. There were plenty of reserves, and in fact, the United States itself was providing subsidies to make sure that the Shah could stay in power. But it was only the beliefs of this that were the important thing in the politics of the situation. And then once the security forces stopped showing up, the Shah fled the country within 2 days. So people often want to know, what's the story with external support? And we find that we only measured one kind of blunt measure of external support, and that's when states gave finances to nonviolent campaigns. We found that it had no discernible effect on their outcomes. And that's probably because in some cases it helped, in some cases it hurt. We're now doing a further study trying to unpack that finding a little bit more and find out what's going on. But we do know that foreign state support through weapons, territory, or funds does increase the effectiveness of armed campaigns by about 15%. That still means that a financed armed campaign is still less successful than a nonviolent campaign operating on its own. So I'm going to wrap up by talking a little bit about the longer-term trajectory. So we know that sometimes violence is successful. You can probably think of a bunch of cases off the top of your head. The American Revolution, Russian Revolution, French Revolution, Vietnam. You can think of a lot of cases off the top of your head, I'm sure. We know them well. But the question is, what happens in these countries afterward? And what are the costs long-term of violent resistance? Well, one thing we know is that violent resistance and civil war in general is the most stable predictor of mass atrocities by the government against the population. Counterinsurgency campaigns often kill many, many civilians through scorched earth techniques and other types of politically motivated mass killing. And so nonviolent campaigns very rarely suffer those types of mass killings for the political reasons that I've laid out. It is not impossible for it to happen, but every dictator knows that it's very politically risky for them to give that order, lest their commanders refuse them. The second thing is the longer-term impacts for the political system itself. This chart shows the probability that a country transitions to a full democracy within 5 years of the end of a campaign. And this axis shows the level of democracy between a -10 and a +10 score. This is called the polity score. It's a 21-point scale that political scientists use to evaluate the political system. And roughly here, -5 to -10 is what you'd call an authoritarian regime. A -5 to a 5 is what you would call kind of a middling regime, an anocracy or a hybrid regime. And then a +5 to a +10 is a democracy. A +10 is like the most advanced kind of democracy. So what we can see here is that if the country was an authoritarian regime when it fought a violent insurgency, the probability that it becomes a democracy never gets above 5%. So in other words, supporting rebel groups in authoritarian regimes almost never allows them to transition into democracies afterward. Among kind of anocracies or weak democracies, hybrid regimes, we see that the probability of armed groups then ushering in periods of democratic reform never climb above 20%. And this is the really chilling finding, that among countries that are democracies, when they're fighting an armed uprising, only 50% of them stay that way 5 years after. For nonviolent campaigns, the picture is much more optimistic. What we see here is that among authoritarian regimes, when they're fighting the campaign, we're already up to about 25 to 30% of them becoming democratic within 5 years of campaign end. Among the hybrid regimes, we're up to about 80% at the upper level. And then among campaigns that are fighting against democracies, almost all of them stay democracies. One of the most amazing findings here is that these hold even when the nonviolent campaigns fail. So even if a nonviolent campaign doesn't itself succeed, it can often usher in periods of internal political reform, maybe this is more like the Burma model, that ultimately allow the country to liberalize down the road. We also find that the countries that emerge from nonviolent resistance campaigns are about 15% less likely to experience a civil war relapse within a decade of the end of the campaign. So what these findings suggest is that nonviolent campaigns are not only associated with short-term political strategic success, but also that they leave behind societies where people can sort of live more peacefully and more freely together. So the implications of this are pretty profound. For scholars like me, it asks me to completely jettison everything I think I know about where power comes from. Because in my schooling, power comes from whoever has the most violence. I mean, a fundamental definition of statehood for political scientists is whichever entity enjoys, quote unquote, the monopoly on the use of violent force. And in fact, this research asks us to consider a different characteristic, which is who has the monopoly on consent and legitimacy, and that's where power flows from. It also asks us to reevaluate the way we construe civilians in the context of conflict. Now, as a conflict scholar, we talk about civilians a lot, but we usually talk about them in the context of their victimization, of their abuse and exploitation, and in terms of their rights. We very rarely think of civilians as agents who can in some way organize and control their own destiny. And this is asking us to look at them as more active agents whose decisions can really impact their own environments. It also asks us to reevaluate the so-called structure agency debate. And this is a bit more of an intellectual debate, but it bears on a lot of things like policy. Because a lot of people think, well, these campaigns of nonviolent action were just succeeding in these contexts because they were probably easy places to win. And that in very hard places, people have no choice. All the choices are taken from them, and they just have to use violence as if it's some kind of automatic response. What we find actually is that these types of situations are unfolding in any type of context you can imagine around the world. That people are actually, newsflash, deciding. Despite the fact that they often face adverse conditions, they can often figure out ways to overcome them. In terms of policymakers, I think that this is a real assault on typical policies that the US government has had and other governments have had in the past on the wisdom of supporting armed actors in other countries. So the real critique that emerges from this material is that, if the US government means what it says when it says that it supports humanitarian efforts, that is not a lot of civilian deaths, if it supports human rights respecting regimes that are relatively more democratic and peaceful, then supporting armed rebel groups is about the worst idea we could possibly develop, because those types of policies are associated with all of these really negative outcomes in the long term, whether those rebel groups succeed or not. So the question then becomes, okay, so whom do we support? And as I mentioned, there's a bit of a dilemma because our research so far shows that financial aid to nonviolent campaigns doesn't do much for them, and in fact, in many cases, might harm them. So for me, it opens up a whole new research agenda about other types of ways to support and enhance and promote nonviolent resistance that maybe doesn't have to do much with governments, that maybe it has much more to do with like us and here, and the way we communicate with activists at home and abroad, and the way we try to support through sharing our knowledge and our skills that we develop through our own activism or our own struggles of various kinds, and the way that we kind of come together and transmit those to people that might be able to use them, and the way that we might be able to learn from them as well, things that apply to our own struggles. So with that, I think what I'm going to do is leave you with all of my contact details. And I'm really excited about the Q&A because this is the fun part where we get really friendly questions, and then we also get insults, and we get all the good stuff. So with that, I open it up to the Q&A. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much.
I have two questions. The first one, I think I know the answer to, but I'd like to hear your take on it. And that is, if nonviolent campaigns are more successful than violent campaigns, why does the general public only hear about the violent ones? That's the first question. The second one is, do you consider the Occupy movement a success or a failure?
So the first question, this was literally the first study ever done to catalog all of the nonviolent campaigns in the world. There's since been other efforts. One is at the Swarthmore College. It's called the Swarthmore Global Nonviolent Action Database, and they have over 1,000 cases that they've cataloged, including things like Sri Lankan veterinarians striking for better elephant conditions. I mean, they go deep, right? And so I highly recommend those types of resources because I think they can be teaching tools. I don't think this is general knowledge, and I think there's no reason it shouldn't become it now that we have the available resources. In terms of the second question, the way that we would code Occupy in our data set is at a failure. However, I don't think it's, I think that they accomplished much. One of which is putting inequality on not just the national but the global agenda for maybe the first time in any kind of serious manner. And that's no small feat. So the other thing I think that they did is they convened a number of people who ordinarily wouldn't have met one another who are now engaging in various forms of activism both nationally and locally in their areas. And I think that's no small feat. So to the extent that it's a failure, it accomplished many things that I think we have yet to see the full effects of down the road.
Hi, my name is Ann Haley. I'm a first-year student here at the Clinton School. And I attended a conference a few weeks ago where, in a workshop that was supporting the idea of increasing the role of women at the table for peace negotiations.
Yep.
One of the panelists made the claim, supported that with a claim that every instance of civil resistance in history that has been initiated by and for the majority led by women has been nonviolent. And I was wondering if any of your research could speak to that idea and support it or anything. Thank you.
Yeah, so that is an empirical claim. That's also an empirical question. And in fact, I know some of the people who were at that conference, and I know the person who made that claim, and I know the person who disagreed with her about the claim. And he came back and said, Erica, is this true? And I said, nobody knows. And he said, can you do a study to find out if it's true? And I said, yes. So that's one of my next things that's going on. Thanks for the question. It's a very small world. We've already covered that ground.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Bob Estes with the Arkansas Coalition for Peace and Justice. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I know there's a lot of examples of movements starting out nonviolent and moving toward violence. Are there many examples of walking that back and shift a focus to what had been a violent movement to become nonviolent again?
Yep, it's a great question. So 30% of the cases in our data set ended up swapping one for the other at some point. And we dealt with that in various ways methodologically to try to tease out the effects. By the way, nonviolent campaigns that move to violence are much less likely to succeed than nonviolent campaigns on their own. That said, yes, there are many examples of nonviolent campaigns that came out of what was perceived to be failed armed struggles. One of them was the Nepalese movement in 2006 against the monarchy. There had been a Maoist insurgency in Nepal for decades. It went nowhere. Ultimately, the civilian population itself launched about 3 months' worth of strikes and demonstrations and protests, and they brought down the regime and then said, okay, Maoists, you can be part of the negotiations and for the new constitution and the new government. South Africa is a potential example where the ANC essentially thought that armed struggle wasn't really working out for them very well, and that they ought to organize mass boycotts, protests in townships, and that they ought to try to internationalize the campaign and move to a more global sanctions and divestment-based strategy. The Palestinian Liberation Movement during the first Intifada abandoned armed struggle and the PLO completely and started organizing civilian-based nonviolent action for at least 18 months. East Timor is a very good example where there was an armed struggle that the consequence of which was an Indonesian occupation that wiped out 50% of the population through counterinsurgency, scorched earth campaigns. That wasn't working out for them, so they abandoned armed struggle, adopted civil resistance, and about a decade and a half later succeeded in becoming an independent country. And El Salvador is a potential case where you had the FMLN and various other armed actors, but what really led to the end of that civil war was general strikes, urban-based labor movement organizing that shifted the preferences of the economic and business community toward actually figuring out a way to end the conflict. So there are various movements like this. There's a new book out that's edited by Veronique Dudoué that catalogs and discusses the reasons why these different armed actors abandoned armed struggle for civil resistance.
Hello, thank you for coming. We appreciate having you here at the Clinton School. I was wondering if you could just respond to, a lot's been written about hashtag activism, right? Like you referenced it before about you're sitting on your sofa, you retweet something, do a hashtag, like a Facebook group or page, feel good about yourself and feel like you've done your part. And I think there are some articles that would suggest that it may need to be more than that to be sustainable, that kind of reassuring your conscience, like, hey, I'm part of this movement, I retweeted something. It may need to be a bit more than that to be sustainable and real. And so I'd love to hear your response to that based on what you said. Like, it's been very informative. And I believe, you know, in the butterfly effect, perhaps, that you were alluding to with the Occupy response that you had about it. It may not solve everything overnight, but it plays its part, you know, moving something forward. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, of if hashtag and retweets and all that have a ceiling in their ability to be effective.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it. They have a ceiling. I'd like to think that a lot of people can find out things they never knew before through the internet. But I have to say that in my experience, the groups that are best at doing that are actually governments, and that they end up using social media and various tools from the internet to find out things about the population they're surveilling. And that actually, on balance, it's done more to harm movements that they've tried to organize online than to help them. In fact, maybe I should qualify the statement of people sitting on the couch by saying sitting on the couch reading a book or playing cards with their family or with their friends or something to get away from this notion that that doing something online counts equivalently to the activism that would count through bonding social capital and bridging social capital and those types of associational life. I mean, I've heard this argument that in some places in the world, the internet's the only place where one can organize. I think that was probably true in the late 2000s, and I think the time has passed where it can be effective places, where it can be an effective substitute for real face-to-face interaction.
I wanted to ask about the effectiveness and the order of civil disobedience. I had consulted with one person, Steve Copley, who's well known here, and he suggested first, of course, as you said yesterday, you need to be as organized as possible, getting all the organizations you possibly can to buy in, as well as the individual advocates. Then he said if it's an urgent situation, like when it looked like the negotiations with Iran were going to falter, to maybe very quickly put together an education panel or something to try to bring in the public, which would, of course, primarily bring in the choir, but that perhaps at the end you could get that choir to buy in to attend something like a rally or another public event. And that leads to my question, at that next step, is it most effective, say, to have a rally, a march, a sit-in? I've heard shutdowns, and we do have one this coming Tuesday, against police shooting and brutality against blacks. It's shut down here everywhere, but Little Rock too. I hear those are actually least effective, but I hope people still do it because of the economy. They don't want to leave, their job for the day. Anyway, what kind of order of civil resistance would you recommend?
Yeah, I don't know. It's really tough to make generalizations because I think these things really are contingent on local context and capacities. That said, I have been collecting data on the sequence of techniques that different movements use, and my understanding is that when we analyze that, we will be able to find pathways, through which these movements succeed. Usually the worst idea is to stick to one technique over and over again. That's what I do know from doing the research is that people get tired, they get burned out, but also the technique loses its effectiveness. And I use this sometimes. If you think about a military strategy and you think about World War I and the trenches, if you think about the fact that for 4 years they sent guys over the top at a very predictable time of day at the same time each week, while the other side just has to mount up a bunch of machine guns and you're not going to take any ground. So the Western Front didn't move more than a couple inches in 4 years because the strategies and techniques were so predictable. So the same thing applies to movements. Which is that they keep using kind of the same tired techniques over and over again. The other side just figures out how to work around them. And I think that's the key takeaway. And in terms of the ideal kind of structuring and sequencing of tactics, that's more learning that we have to do through kind of building on the data we've got.
Hi, thanks for coming. My name is Susanna O'Daniel. I wondered if you could comment on the increase in permissive gun laws and how that relates to your conclusions.
Yeah, so some people before have extended our findings to relate to whether it's a good idea for like what would be the most effective check against tyranny. And there was one woman who wrote a blog post called a breakup letter to the Second Amendment or something like that, where she used our study as a citation to support the claim that having a well-armed militia is no longer the best check against a tyrannical government, and that in fact, when you're facing a tyrannical government with overwhelming military superiority, basically your only option is to do well-planned, well-executed nonviolent resistance. So some people have made that claim. I think that in our case, most of the cases that we look at are not democracies. And so, you'd have to make a couple of inferential assumptions to make that kind of application, but it's certainly an implication that people have drawn before.
Let's thank Erica Chenoweth for being with us.